and share the agenda, okay? I will admit all participants and disable the waiting room.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? It's nice to see you all from Jamaica here following us one day more. Actually, today is really the last day of this training on risk-based food inspection. So I hope that this training was fruitful these days and you learn some concepts to apply in your daily work and also to improve or make some changes in your procedures that you have questioned or you have analyzed through this training that they need to be changed, because I think it's always good to renew and to update everything in terms of what is being developed. And I think it's just for resource to optimize resources and also optimize time and human resources, not only financial, but also human. And risk-based inspection is the best approach for that. Good. So today, Marianne is going to talk about the sampling program. Actually, this is a new section. It's another section. It's not part in the manual, but it's a big important session. It's also sampling is an important topic within Codex Alimentarius. There is really a Codex committee on sampling, because every product needs to be sampled in a different way and some measures need to be taken. And Marianne found interesting, and also she got a lot of requests from countries to give a better overview on the sampling. Also, Marianne discussed with me that you were discussing about the carcass sampling a few days back. So, and she was sharing with me some information that I will share in the chat later and also by email, because it's true that, okay, there is a guide for foodborne disease, integrated foodborne disease surveillance for AMR, and it's indicated the sampling, but it doesn't go into detail. And also with Codex Alimentarius. Codex Alimentarius goes probably a better more in detail, saying the kilos or milliliter representative that you need to take, but it also doesn't go into details how to conduct this carcass sampling, for example. But we found some information, and Marianne kindly provide us, and we will share with you. Maybe in a point it should be discussed within the Codex Alimentarius sampling committee, just to develop some specific procedures for sampling, explaining step by step everything, because sampling is really a gray area in some countries and it needs to be improved because everyone does it in a different way. I think it's also applicable different ways of sampling, but to have a real guideline will contribute to have a standardized way for the countries to operate. And good, so I don't want to extend myself too much, and I would like to give the welcome to Ms. Marianne Green. Thank you all for participating today. I will be in the room, and just if you have some questions or some concerns, please write them in the chat box and later we can have some discussions. So please, Marianne.
Welcome, everyone. This has been, as always, a fascinating discussion and lots of questions. Today is, as Margarita said, a little bit different. This is part of an inspection program, or perhaps better said, this is part of a compliance monitoring program and part of food safety controls, though it is not per se inspections. I like to start off by really talking about what we're going to deal with today in a very, very high level discussion. This is not something that you can do just in an hour or two in presentations. You have to really think of it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between sampling plan, sampling directions, which is the guidance on how to sample, and the really critical issue of sampling programs. And sampling programs are the first level of concepts and principles that should be developed before you develop sampling plans or look for any concrete processes or procedures for sampling. Most countries have a sampling activity, and I'm using the word activity specifically. Sampling is a tool. It's an expensive tool. It takes a lot of human resources, and it takes a lot of financial resources, where you're looking at established laboratories, you're looking at accreditation, and you're looking at a whole lot of what is essentially a fairly expensive proposition. So why do you sample? We have inspectors who have every ability to look at unsanitary conditions in the food, in the processing part, but they cannot look at micro or chemical contamination. So that's one of the reasons that sampling programs are developed. But sampling in and of itself is just a tool. It is one tool, as inspection is a tool. And it is used within a food safety program and must be used in a thoughtful and well-planned manner. If you can't establish the reason for sampling, don't sample. Why I say this is I have had a number of discussions with various inspection services and inspectors who have been sampling for many years. And when I ask them what they do with the sample results, they say they give it to the food business. And in most cases, that simply is a quality assurance process. That is not a sampling program. You are simply doing quality assurance for that food business. While you may take enforcement action or compliance action on a non-compliant sample, the chances of finding it on a regular basis, if you're taking one sample a year or a few every month, you're not going to find enough to truly make a difference in your compliance sampling. So reasons for sampling. When you're establishing your sampling program, there are generally 4 reasons for sampling. One is monitoring, and this is a statistically based selection of random samples from normal appearing populations. They are generally not detained. So what you're looking at is, if you have X number of food businesses of this particular sector, you would develop a random sampling plan, and you would generally go out and take samples of that product from that food business, and you would analyze it as a whole. You would analyze the sector, not the samples, the sector sample, so the entirety of it. Surveillance is a little more targeted. You think you have a problem, you haven't quite figured it out, whether it is there's some indication in your monitoring program that there's something off here, or you think there's a problem, but you're not sure whether it's across the entire sector or across more than one sector. And then you would move into what is generally called a surveillance sample program. This is a program. It is not, I find a non-compliant and I go back and take samples. You're doing it within a national program. The national program can, of course, be broken up by inspection service, but in general, it's designed at a national basis. So you're looking at whether you're trying to actually determine the extent, if there is a food safety program, and the extent in a specific subset of food. It can be a specific subset of food businesses, and it can be a specific subset of imported product. So this is where you start. It's not a complete target, but it's a semi-target, and it's targeted based on what you have analyzed and found from other programs. The third type of sample is generally a compliance and enforcement sample. This is primarily considered unplanned. You can plan how many monitoring samples you can do. You can plan how many surveillance you can do. You cannot plan compliance and enforcement because these are resulting from identified problems. So if you have a non-compliance in your monitoring and or surveillance, you may wish to take more samples. Let's say at a particular food business, you may wish to take more food samples, and this would be compliance or enforcement. It can be taken during a food business inspection to determine the sanitation across the entire process of that food business. It may come up as a result of a consumer or trade complaint. These are generally considered unscheduled types of samplings. You can identify how many, you can estimate how many you may have over a year, but you generally cannot plan them for a specific date. The last type of sampling that is a category of sampling programs is prosecutions. And these are really taken where you want evidence to put before the court. These would generally be where you absolutely have to maintain chains of custody from taking the sample right through to getting it to the laboratory, and the laboratory has to maintain chains of custody and be able to provide evidence in court that you can guarantee this is the sample that you took in the process and everything else. So that's a different process. And again, it is generally not put into the planned or even the unplanned activity unless you go to court a lot of times. So those are evidence-based for prosecutions and are not food safety objective sampling. So what is an annual sampling plan? If it's not a program, what is it? It fundamentally takes all of the planned sample activity, including the unscheduled but can be estimated sampling activity, and puts it in one document. So you don't have to run around and find anything. So these planned samples include all the monitoring samples that have been scheduled, all the surveillance samples that have been scheduled, and the estimated number of enforcements. So similarly, when you are doing a risk-based inspections planning process, you would do a sampling planning process. Same way, built on an ongoing cycle where you would look at the, develop your plan, have it implemented, and analyze it so you can improve your targeting and your processes for sampling over the next year. I have had on a number of occasions training where when I opened the discussion around an annual sampling plan, I had inspectors point to the laboratory and I had the laboratory point to the inspection services. Neither is correct. The sampling plan must be negotiated. It is a labor of love, if you want, between laboratories and inspection services. Neither one nor the other can do it alone. For food inspectors, the sampling plan provides in one document the number of samples to collect, the types of products to sample, when to sample, where to sample, how to sample, where to send the samples, and what results, and the results with any actions. So this is an SOP for inspectors. For the laboratory, it also provides information on the number of samples to be collected, the analysis to be done, when the samples will arrive. And for laboratories, it is very important. So in a planning process, so they can manage when they get their samples, when they need all their reagents, when they have to have the appropriate equipment and people on hand, on how they can manage their resources effectively. So for example, in a monitoring program, which is generally just looking at product more generally across the entire national food profile, they may be able to batch certain samples and thus be much more effective particularly in the area of chemical analysis. Rather than doing one at a time, they can do a number at one time. So it is both important for the inspector, but it's also very important for the laboratory. The annual sampling plan essentially sets out what products are to be sampled, the timing, the number to be sampled, and it does set out the objectives and the procedures. When you're dealing with procedures, you want to be able to give to the inspector the objective. Why are you sampling? It helps. The inspector has a lot of information around the food businesses and the food profiles within the country. So giving them the rationale for why you're taking this sample means they can better plan their processes, better understand and respond to what they're doing. You want to tell them where to sample. If you're dealing with an import program, do you want them to sample at the importer, or do you want them to sample at the market or a market where it's being sold? Do you want them to deal with it at a farm, at the processing plant, or again at a market where it's being sold? So you need to tell the inspector where they want it, where the sample must be picked up. Priorities, sample size, sample transport, analytical tests. It is very useful to provide the standard for non-compliance for the inspector and any follow-up and reporting action. Okay, so that's a very, very high overview of a sampling program. Okay, and what it basically is set out to deal with. So the next thing is how you develop a plan. So remember, I said the program is the overall concepts, and the programs, you're going to take monitoring, surveillance, or compliance samples. You're going to have a negotiation process, and then you have to have an annual plan, and the annual plan would be negotiated annually. The first one, and I do get a lot of questions on the terminology here, is what I call environmental scanning. In Codex, I also talk about situational analysis, and this is in the Codex National Food Control Programs. And it also is consistent with the concepts of risk categorization that we talked about earlier. You want to look at the food profile. What food is being consumed, by whom, where it's coming from, and who's producing it. So you're trying to say, did anything change in the last year? In some cases, you're going to have a lot of things like trend analysis. Food becomes trendy. It becomes something that new and interesting that people want to eat. You want to note that. Is there any emerging hazards that might have come up on the international scale? 30 years ago, when I was going through my training and processes, I don't think I ever heard antimicrobial resistance. That's something that is emerging. So this environmental scanning and situational awareness is really saying, has anything changed in our food consumption patterns? Are there any new hazards? And what did we see in our last year program? And the whole intention of this analysis is really looking at, did we do monitoring samples for the last 3 or 4 years and find zero non-compliance? So you're sort of saying, can we redirect resources? Is there an area that's emerging, new food, a new hazard that we need to start taking account of? You want to look at information of management strategies. So even though inspection also looks at the inspection results from last year and does a trend analysis and an analysis of the various sectors or even across businesses, you may want to add in to your analysis your sampling results. It may be driving you to look at pesticide usage or enhance education of food business. So similarly to the inspection results that you want to have a systematic process for analyzing the results of your samples. So what you're trying to do after you've done your analysis, you generally would move forward into looking at the monitoring and surveillance programs. So what foods do you want to monitor? What foods do you want to put into your surveillance programs? So if you're starting to see non-compliance in in one of or more of the products in your monitoring program, you might move them into surveillance. If you're looking at where you've got into surveillance and something that you thought was a problem, it never shows up in your targeted surveillance, you may move them back into monitoring. I have been asked on a number of occasions, where does certification fit in this? Certification should be in the monitoring program. If you're doing sampling for export certification or for free sale within a country, it should be in the monitoring, because you're assuming these products are of good quality, they're going to meet all the requirements, and therefore there should not be problems. So you are monitoring them as well. So if you have an export program that requires a sampling program like the EU does for vet drugs and other products that are used in particular in fish products, you want to make sure that you have a good monitoring program and that you can show how it's planned, assessed, and planned, delivered, and assessed. So in developing this process, you actually need to identify which foods. So cheese is going to be in the monitoring program, but we've seen some problems with fish. So I want to move fish into the surveillance. I want to do cheese for pasteurization. I want to do milk for adulteration with water. I want to do fish for listeria or toxin. You do it for chemicals, and you can do it for micro. You can even add into your sampling plan, and sometimes countries find this the most effective way, is to add things like label reviews. Again, they may not be part of your inspection program. They may be part of your sampling program. You can do things, adulteration. You could even do things like pH meters and have this built into your sampling plan. It can be built into your inspection plan, but that will depend on the country on how they want to deal with it. So once you've dealt with, what foods, what hazards you want to analyze. Sorry, gotta go back for a second. So you've really looked at your monitoring and surveillance programs. You identified what foods and what hazards you want to use. Now you need to look at the sample objectives and sample numbers. You can go, and Margarita talked about codex documents. You can look at other appropriate documents such as the ICMSF, which always gets my tongue twisted up. For chemicals, you can look at AOC, AO, American Association of Analytical Chemists. There are a number of different references that you can use to help you establish the numbers. All right, so your sampling objective might be to see the % compliance in in cheese of a particular pathogen or a particular possibly chemical that might be used in cleaning or something. You would set your objective, you state it very clearly what your objective is and the sample numbers that you're looking at. Sorry, go back. In most instances, when you're setting up these numbers, these are the ideal sample numbers. Please use the ideal sample numbers in the first in this step 3, recognizing that in step 4, you are going to be negotiation. It is almost certain, and I mean, it doesn't matter whether you are a developed or developing or any country, that what was originally proposed for numbers won't survive step 4. Step 4 is about negotiating. What are your numbers? What are your analysis, feasibility, and any special requirements, whether instructions for the inspector or things that the laboratory has to address. In some cases, you may have developed a plan that is looking at a new analysis because something is happening out internationally and you want to take a note to see if there's an issue in your country, in this case, Jamaica, of course. So the laboratory may never have done that analysis before. They may not have the reagents, they may not have the procedures. And if they're a certified lab, accredited lab, they may need to build that into their accreditation process. So negotiation is not just about numbers, it's also about what is to be done, how you deal with non-compliance if it's a new analysis, what is the standard? Have you established a standard? Is there a standard in codex? All those are part of the negotiations. So once you've had that discussion, and sometimes it can take a long time, you would update your plan, your draft plan, and you would develop a final draft plan that outlines what foods would be sampled, when, by whom, for which lab, and analyzed for what hazard. Once you have done this once, the first time is hard because it's all a learning process. Once you've done this once, there may be a lot of repetition from year to year. You may end up with somewhere in the range of 60, 70, 80% repetition year to year, because your monitoring probably is looking at your highest volume foods, your highest risk foods. So you're not necessarily going to be doing this from zero every year. The first year is harder. Also, you will have a much better understanding of what the laboratories can and can't do, and what the inspectors can and can't do after the first year. You would also want to look at any new sampling procedures. If you're dealing with a new product, if you're dealing with a new analysis, you would say, okay, all of these new processes have to have new guidance. Maybe also there has a need to amend the old guidance. Perhaps there was problems between the sampling that was done by an inspector and getting the appropriate results at the laboratory. So there may also need to be an update of any old guidance that needs to be, improved. And then the final process is to based on all of that work that you've done, is to finalize the annual sampling plan in consultation with laboratories and inspection services. So really and truly, you develop something, you work through the processes, you negotiate, you provide it to the laboratories and the inspectors for consultation, you update it, you finalize it, and then you put it out to all of the inspectors. Step 8, as I said, is distribution. You want to get the sampling plan out, if possible, at least a month before you start. You expect them to start taking samples. Okay, if you can get it out 2 or 3 months before, that's great as well. And it also depends when your annual plan, when your fiscal year starts and you start a new planning implementation process. If you are starting something on January 1st or in and around a holiday period, you want to get it out to the inspectors much earlier. If your year starts, let's say February or in the middle of the summer, and there's no major issues, you can probably get it out a little later. But this is really, you want to provide it so the inspection districts, parishes, inspectors can build this into their plan. So remember I said that in the inspection plan, you had your planned activities and your unscheduled activities. At the district level, there will be a new line now, sample pickup. It's the scheduled process. It's a scheduled activity for your monitoring and your compliance. So you will have that in your planned activities. You will have another line in your inspection at the district level that is in your unscheduled or unplanned activities that would be your compliance or enforcement samples. Okay. And then there's a need to have an ongoing monitoring of that implementation, and both of the plan and the analytical results hopefully fairly frequently. If you have a database, this can be an ongoing process, but I would suggest as a minimum if it's done by paper on a quarterly basis, because you may need to readjust the plan as needed. Or maybe another problem comes up and you need to add samples for compliance or enforcement. You may need to do different samples because you're starting to see foodborne illnesses. So you may need to readjust the sampling plan as needed. Once the sampling plan has been completely delivered, you want to analyze the results. You want to develop a report. I'm not saying this is a published report. You want to do that analysis. You want to analyze the results, and you're normally going to end up with some sort of draft document or final document that will allow you to circle back to the environmental scans and the situational analysis. So this report of the analysis is your first step in your environmental planning. And that's the process for developing a sampling plan. So the last part of this presentation is really about what would be in the guidance for inspectors on sampling. I've talked about it at a high level, talked about it in a previous slide. You want to be able to provide the timing, the samples, the products, the objectives, the location, the priorities, the sample size, sample transport, analytical tests, and standard for non-compliance reporting, and any follow-up. You need to give the inspector instructions. It isn't sufficient to say, well, you could find your own. It's better to be very consistent, very structured, and provide the inspector with the appropriate information. It is not that the inspector doesn't know, it's that this way you are making sure that everybody's doing the same thing. It's consistency. So when I talk about guidance, one of the first things is the product, but it's also the location for sampling. Where do you want the inspector to go? You want them to go to retail, processing plants, marker, importer, or even farms? Because this has to be part of their planning processes. If you're not having them do it as part of an inspection, but there is a particular product that needs to be sampled in a particular week from a particular area, they have to put that into their travel processes. Okay. Where there are multiple products that could be sampled, you need to give guidance on priorities. You don't want to be so specific, unless it is required, to simply have the inspector go to that place, say it's not available, that product's not available, so they walk away. And that's a waste of resources. So if the monitoring program is on a particular product and it covers local, regional, national, or international products, you might give them the priority that you want them to go to X market, and if possible, find a local product. If they can't find a local product, you want them to pick up a regional product. If at that market they can't find a regional product, pick up a national one, something produced anywhere in the country. And if they can't find anything that comes from that country, pick up an international product. If you don't want to deal with imports, you would say to them, you may pick up local, regional, or national, but don't pick up an international. So you give them a really clear understanding of what you are looking for in your objectives, and then you give them the priorities for the same thing. You may also be talking about, so for example, if you're looking at a microbiological content of some cheese, you might suggest, because you have a particular interest in soft cheeses, that's the priority, but you may want them to pick up hard cheeses if they can't find a soft cheese. This is about ensuring that you have effective sampling from the inspector when they're going out to pick it up. Oh, sorry, and I'll go back. Remember, during our discussion on inspection, we did say that for effectiveness, if there was a sample to be picked up at a processing plant, that could be done during the inspection for efficiency and effectiveness. It is not that you are assessing the plant at that time. You are picking up a sample for the program to make effective use of your time. The sampling plan should also set out guidance on sample size, because it is not possible for the inspector to know or remember all the sample sizes that were required. So you're talking to the inspector about whether the final packaged product is needed. If you really need intact products and final packaged products, say that. Are you taking this product from bulk samples? How many samples from large bulk products? How many samples from smaller retail? One of the problems that you run into is if you have a large prepackaged bulk product, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 kilograms, it starts to get very expensive to pick up samples. If you have to take 5, 10 kilograms intact products. So you must be very clear on what you're sampling, how many samples, whether you must have an intact sample or whether you can take a portion thereof. And I'm talking about being fairly specific in terms of if each product weighs 3 kilograms or greater, take 2. If it weighs less than 550 grams, take 10. You need to be specific about what the guidance is on the number and the quantity of sampling. You want to provide very clear guidance or instructions on sampling techniques. Is this aseptic requirements? Is it not aseptic? Is there guidance on the priorities? So for example, you may want to do micro samples before you do chemical samples. Take the samples for microbial analysis before you take the samples for chemical analysis. So you want to actually give them, do you need gloves? Disposable gloves? Do you need a trier? What is the techniques that you're talking about? And the equipment used to provide it, to allow those techniques that the inspector needs. So this is about giving the inspector guidance on what and how they want to sample. The sampling plan also provides guidance on what happens to that lot. Whether that lot needs to be detained until the sample results are known, or whether it can be released to market. Because by definition, monitoring is expected to be compliant, you are anticipating that whatever results come back from your foods within the monitoring program will be compliant, meet the standards. Those products are generally released. It often is useful to say to the food business, especially if it's at the level of a food business sampling, that if there is a problem, you may need to recall it, but that if the food business then chooses to hold on to it, then that's their decision. With regard to monitoring samples that are detained, it behooves the inspector to tell the laboratory that this is detained, so that the laboratory doesn't batch things 3-4 months down the road and this food has been detained for the whole concept. So monitoring generally released, though there is a need to be aware of if there is problems, the product may need to be recalled. Surveillance samples are this is in the in-between process. If you're really concerned about what you might find, then and because it's only a probability, it's not like a compliance where you have a problem and you're addressing it. You would be looking at what the result is, what the potential results are, the hazards, the level of risk, and you would determine how it's going to be addressed, whether it's detained or not. In some cases, it may also be if there's a higher risk of having a non-compliance and the food business isn't very good at recalls, you may want to detain it. Again, where you're looking at detaining a product, you have to be very clear as to the sample analysis schedule. Because it isn't fair to a food business to say, we're going to detain this and then take a long time to get the results back. Compliance and enforcement samples are almost always detained if it's on a lot, because you are starting to look at this as, we have a problem, we've got to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, where it's happening, the extent of the lots involved. Therefore, because you have much more of an issue that you're addressing, those lots that you sample would be detained. The reason for this level of detailed guidance is to ensure that the samples can be analyzed when the laboratory receives them. The worst thing is picking up a sample, sending it to the lab, and the lab looking at it and going, I can't do anything with this. So if there are some problems or issues around any sort of guidance, you should be looking at the supervisor, your district supervisor, your parish supervisor, or any colleague who has been identified as a contact, and they may reach out to the laboratory for direction to make sure that you actually can analyze the lab so the lab can actually analyze the product based on what they result. And so this again becomes important for the laboratory to receive the product in good order. What's the destination of the sample? If you have more than one laboratory, which is it going to? Because the laboratory has set its schedule based on understanding when it's going to get these products. You want them transported to that laboratory as soon as possible. Where they're refrigerated or frozen, you want them transported in cooler with a sufficient quantity of coolants to maintain integrity. If samples are not shipped immediately, and this is perfectly legitimate, if you're picking up a series of 10 samples across 10 days, you may want to put them all in one location and then take them all together, drive them to the laboratory or however they're transported. You want them to store them in a secure location at the appropriate temperature. In these cases, while it is not chain of custody requirements for storage, you do want to be able to say, particularly in the case where you have a sample that turns out to be non-compliant, that they could not have been tampered or adulterated by anybody. They were stored in a secure location. They were secured in a cooler when they were going to the laboratory, and the laboratory can also, accredited laboratory can also verify handling process, because you want to minimize any chance that the food business tells you, well, it wasn't our fault, you must have done something to it. And I'm sure that that's happened before. I mean, samples are often held before they're shipping. In our location, some of the samples have to be shipped by plane. Planes only go every so often. They're not, you can't sort of walk to the airport and say, here's it. So often the samples are picked up and then they're securely maintained until it's ready to go to the plane to be shipped off. You want to list what the tests are that are being done. You've told them what you're doing earlier, but you still want to make sure that the tests are being listed. What tests? Microbiological, chemistry, physical, compositional. And this is not always the case, but some sampling plans also put in the analytical method. So listeria using this method, biotoxins using this method, pesticide using this method. It simply is a way of giving a little more information and confirming that this is what you're doing with this methodology. The title of the analytical method, this is not something that's mandatory, it's something that's useful, because often this analytical method would be established as part of the laboratory standard during accreditation. one of the things that you need to deal with is listing the result for each method. When would this sample be deemed non-compliant? Okay. And this is particularly important because the laboratory should not be addressing non-compliance. There are many cases where it is only through the assessment of GMPs or HACCP programs after finding a non-compliant sample that you will be able to actually make the final determination of non-compliance. This is something that a lot of areas are hard because most inspection services believe that it is the laboratory that should designate non-compliance. But really and truly, it is the inspection service that should be making that final determination. So it is important in the guidance documents and sampling plans to actually put that standard down. An example of what I was talking about with regard to HACCP is something along the lines of malachite green in certain fish products. This was a very, very contentious product issue in Canada. And because as a vet drug, it's an adulterant and you're not allowed any product. But we also had some environmental contamination that was pretty pervasive in some of the fishing areas. And we were getting certainly wild caught fish with malachite, very, very low levels. So what ended up was that there was a set process by which all product above X amount was deemed adulterated. All product below X amount was considered no health hazard, environmental contamination, but no health risk. The period between the two was the two standards was based on what the inspector found in the environment of the aquaculture site, because we were mainly testing aquaculture. If there was clearly application of this vet drug, then it was non-compliant. If there was no indication of any use of this drug, then it would be deemed compliant. So it was the inspector that had to make the final decision based on the guidance on the standards, and that was in the sampling plan. You want to provide guidance on who gets the report. So the laboratory needs to know where they are reporting. Are they reporting to both the inspector and a parish office or head office? What are they reporting and who receives that report? And the last thing the inspector needs is some indication of compliance and enforcement action. If the food has been released to the market, you would generally undertake a food safety investigation and the potential consideration of recall. You may also be starting to do more compliance sampling and enforcement sampling. Where the product has been held, there still is a food safety investigation, but there would probably be product action. It could be destroyed. It could be, if it was an imported product, it could be re-exported or it could be reworked. Sampling, unplanned sampling, which is the third level, the compliance sampling, it can be undertaken in order to supplement information. It should not be taken, as we've talked about during the inspection training, where unsanitary conditions are determined through the inspection observation. If the inspector can see unsanitary conditions, you will not need to sample. You should not sample. However, if things are looking fairly good, but you think there's unsanitary processes and you can't tell, there may need to be sampling during an inspection. But this is not done where you actually can observe the unsanitary processes. Sampling can also be done where you're simply having to take the sample this week. You have to take it at a processing plant. You're doing an inspection anyways. So you're taking the sample at the same time you're inspecting. It's an efficiency process. Because it's part of the efficiency process, you want to verify your sample plan as part of your preparation for an inspection. So whenever you're going into a plant, you look at, or you're preparing for your week's inspection, you would look at your sampling plan and say what samples are needed for what analysis, for which laboratory, and you would assemble all the tools that you require. Okay. Because this is an efficiency process, you want to make sure that you aren't getting to the food business only to find out you don't have the appropriate tools to do the sampling. And that is the end of the sampling overview. There is a lot of information in here, so I just going to leave it there for a second in terms of questions. Suzanne.
Good morning. How are you
Good
doing?
morning.
This is welcome. We've been struggling for a while to develop our sampling plan. I would like to know if there, how you come up with a guidance standard document, because a lot of the industry players would ask, okay, so what is a national standard? Are we compliant? And it has been a challenge for years. For us, when we're doing export samples, we would take send it to the EU, we use the EU. We send it to the US, we use the US.
Yep.
Is there example, first of all? You know, I love examples. Is there an example where we can look at the country's guidance standard document?
No, because
Or
you've actually,
okay, go ahead.
You've actually answered your own question. In a sampling plan, all right, so I'm sampling fish. I'm sampling aquaculture fish for vet drugs. In your sampling process that you're giving to the inspector, you would tell them what they're sampling for, okay? You would put in the standard, the EU standard, and you would put the US standard. And if the food business is primarily exporting to the US and it meets that standard, then it would be eligible for export certification. You don't sample every lot that goes necessarily. If you have a sampling plan that is built, a program that has an annual plan attached that said we are going to do 4, 5, 6% overall of all the lots that go, you can then show based on random testing, you've covered all your food businesses, you do it fairly multiple times, you cover all the vet drugs that are required, you can certify for export based on those particular, the results from that plan. You do not want to get into sampling per lot, and because what happens often is you sample and it's fine, it's sent overseas, they sample and it's not fine, which brings your sampling program into disrepute. So you want to mix, for exports, you're wanting to mix up the ongoing inspections, any HACCP requirements, so that they are actually building their own programs. They have to understand what the export market requires, and then you build your program as a monitoring to give added assurance that this is happening. And if over the year there is not one product that is rejected, then that is a way of having greater assurance that their HACCP program is working. Does that answer your question? It's a complex approach.
It is. All right. That's for export. What about local now?
Your same process happens for local. You should be setting up a plan, a program that says, jerk chicken, because we used that the other day. You know the number, you should, under your food profile, know the number of food businesses that are producing this. You should be able to get a representative number of samples into the laboratory for analysis over a year. It's not doing it all at once. It's trying to set it out over the year. So you have a representative process over the year. It is, excuse me, while Codex talks about using a statistical program or approach to getting that representative sample, a randomized sample, I have found that most countries cannot meet the level of the number of samples at a statistical randomized sample. And so what you're trying to do is representative. If you have 100,000 food businesses that are producing jerk chicken, and it's one of your highest consumed products, you may want to build that review over those representatives over a year or 2 years. Your monitoring program doesn't have to be all done in 1 year. So you might want to do so many percentage. You can't do 100,000. Maybe you're going to do 1,000 a year, and how you can build that. But if you're truly getting a representative sample in, you're already starting to build your database on what you should be expecting, and you can correlate that with your inspection processes. So if you're finding samples in your jerk chicken in a certain area or district or parish, and you're also finding problems or issues with the same food businesses that are producing that, you have some good evidence you've got a problem that you can do more investigation. So you want to correlate your sample results with your food safety and with your food inspections as well. You can do this for poultry. You can do it for, you can do it for eggs. You said your farms have to be vaccinate against salmonella. You can do a representative sample, maybe 1 lot a year, 2 lots a year, 3 lots a year, whatever works for your analysis in your laboratory, and get a good overview of whether or not there are any problem food businesses in that particular sector.
All right, thanks. One last thing. If the country doesn't have a national standard yet,
Yep.
Can we use the Codex as a guideline interim until it has been passed? Because it might take a little while to go through to be passed and stuff.
Okay. So this is where, to some extent, you need to get a good legal advice. I don't know your laws enough. Again, I've said this before, but I don't know them. In our laws, right, it says you're not allowed to sell a product that has a toxic or harmful substance on it. And you're not allowed to sell a product that was produced under unsanitary conditions. If you're using a Codex standard, because you don't have a national standard, the easiest standard to apply would be these are the toxins and these are the standards. So pesticides, additives, all your chemicals would have a specific parts per million, parts per billion, whatever it is as the way of a standard. Same thing for salmonella, no salmonella in 25 grams of sampled product, whatever the general approach is. However, where you don't have a standard and you want to use the Codex or other standard, a recognized international standard, like I said, for the International Commission on the Microbial Specifications of Food, you would say, if you exceed this standard, we will deem this product having a toxic or a harmful substance on it, or whatever the terminology you use for that. Or in the case of microbiological, you might say if it does not meet Codex standards, we will deem it to be produced under unsanitary conditions, because Codex is the international international standard setter for sanitary conditions with its hygiene hygiene code and its other codes. So you would say, then you would take a particular line in your law that forbids selling or makes it a offense to sell a product produced under unsanitary conditions. And you would say unsanitary conditions would be inferred by any product that has this particular level of salmonella, this particular level of listeria, staph, whatever one you deem, and you link it very clearly to your law. And when you prosecute, you're not prosecuting on the policy, you're prosecuting on the fact that it was an offense to sell a product that was produced under unsanitary conditions. I'm not sure if that's not an easy concept, but it's well established in most countries which come from the British common law. This concept of having an interpretive document that says when you would deem something unsanitary. Because you can't cover everything in regs, can't. Even regs have interpretive documents and guidance documents. You would have to run that through all of your legal processes, and it's a legal policy process, but that's where it's at.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments, questions, clarifications?
Question.
Sure.
When you mentioned monitoring, you spoke about random sampling.
Yep.
Could you expound on that? Because I'm wondering if you meant random sampling, meaning when you're conducting sampling, as I understand random sampling, for a true random sample, each item in the lot needs to have an equal chance of being taken, which can be extremely tedious and very long if you're going to do that every single time. Is that what you were saying when you were speaking about monitoring?
So yes and no. Your lot is the number of food producers that produce that particular food, not the lot of food. Your monitoring programs should be based on randomized, statistically randomized samples of the lot, which in this case is food businesses, not the individual lot.
Okay,
So
okay,
the program is built on the food businesses, what you know is being sold. The sampling guidance, when you get to the actual, I'm going to sample cheese, or I'm going to sample eggs, or I'm going to sample fish, this fish, then you would give them the guidance that they need to deal with, okay? At the lot level. So there's two levels. The program is built at the food business or the food level at the remember I said food profile? That's what you're talking about. The guidance for how to is built at when you actually go to sample. Similar to what I said to the last one is, while the gold standard is randomized sampling programs, so that you have every food business has equal opportunity to be sampled, and you set a certain minimal level for that sampling program, it is almost impossible for any country to have sufficient laboratory analysis. Many countries, what they will do is do a representative sample. And that representative sample of the food businesses might be one sample per food business per year. It might be 5 samples for large food businesses a year, 2 samples per medium food businesses per year, and 1 for little ones, for small micro. You build that into your program. This is your program design. Okay. How many lots do I have to, how many food businesses do I have to sample? How many lots do they produce? What is the level of sampling of each food business that I want? And it can be of each importer that I want. It could be of each, how many products come in from EU, from Canada, from New Zealand, from China? How many do I want to sample? Because they have this percentage in my food profile. I know how much is coming in. So all of that is in the, and I go back to it, there's a sampling program that you are having a reason for establishing. And then the sampling plan is a subset of that program. It's how you implement it. It's really complex. It's not something that you just go out and say, we're going to put it together. Because you've got to bring your principles in, your concepts in, your understanding of food profiles, who's producing what, who's importing what, from where it's coming. Sometimes it's dealt with in the food profile. So you're looking at starting at some of your biggest, your highest consumption products are some of the first ones you're going to do on monitoring to get a handle on whether or not the highest consumed products are really causing any problems. Other ways to go is hooking it on food illnesses. So if you have a good surveillance program for foodborne illnesses, maybe you're going to start on foods that give you a high level of food illnesses. But you start out by saying, what's the concept, how, where, what's food, and why am I sampling? Not easy.
True.
And I'm going to go back to the random versus the representative on a lot by lot basis. You're absolutely right. It's almost impossible to truly do a full randomized sample on any one lot. And also, a large percentage of the time, you are not actually going to see the entire lot. Let's say an import program, you're not even going to get the full lot. The lot might have gone to 4, 5, 6 countries. It was imported by Massey's and it was distributed across the Caribbean. You're not seeing the whole lot. So it's impossible for you to do a true randomized sampling procedure. So what you might want to be starting to talk to your inspectors about is about how you do a representative sample of that lot, of what is presented to you for sampling. If you're going to a supermarket or a local market, it is very unlikely you will see the entire lot because the lot may have been broken up and sent, the farm may have been sending product to 5, 6, 7 different markets or different stalls or different people bought it. So again, you're looking for representativity, not necessarily because randomness. The representativity may be more important in terms of your results than the randomness.
Okay. One more question.
Sure. No.
Okay. Early in the week, or I think last week, can't remember. You said that if an inspector sees something wrong, he or she should not take a sample.
Yes.
But then today you mentioned sampling for compliance/enforcement and compliance for court cases.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, because I got the impression that if you said that if you saw something wrong, it's best you didn't sample. But then today you mentioned sampling for enforcement compliance when you saw something wrong. So I was just wondering.
No, not necessarily when you see something wrong. If the previous sample that you had came back as non-compliant, you may be moving from, let's say, a monitoring or surveillance and going into a compliance enforcement process and taking a series of samples, even during an inspection, but it's not where I visually see something wrong. If I see something wrong, I shouldn't be doing compliance and enforcement samples. I may take other lots. I may do other things. This is where both in the inspection processes and in the sampling processes, there needs to be, it isn't the inspector that's going to make these decisions by himself or herself. This is where you want to have, whether it's a senior specialist who's responsible or a supervisor or a mixture of teams, you're trying to say, this is where I've got a problem. Okay. And therefore, I want to make sure that the full extent of the problem is discussed and the appropriate tool, whether it's inspection or sampling, is used in that process. What you don't want to start doing is, I've walked into a plant as part of my general planned inspection, and I'm seeing contaminated food contact surfaces. You don't want to take a sample of the food that is going over that. Okay. If they clean it up as a result of that inspection, and you believe you want to, so you no longer can see that debris, unsanitary conditions on the contact surfaces. If you believe that you need to confirm that they had cleaned it properly, you may address a compliance and enforcement. It's not an absolute either way, with one exception where you see the non-compliance, don't sample. But when it's borderline, you're coming back after an inspection, a food safety investigation or a corrective action, or you've got a non-compliant sample and you're coming back, that's when you're starting to move into compliance and enforcement samples. This is where you need to work it through in the sense of having this discussion on what the concepts and processes are, so that there's enough detailed guidance for inspectors when to say that moving to a compliance enforcement sample would work and when they shouldn't. What I recommend with any compliance and enforcement sample is that there be a discussion with supervisors, specialists, even laboratories, before taking anything at the laboratory, so that there's really good understanding that this is not going to end up with a sample that's contradicting what you're seeing in the plant. Okay, does that work?
Thank you.
I'm trying not to be contradictory of this, but sometimes it sounds like it because I'm I'm speaking a bit too fast. Suzanne.
All right. What's your feedback of
so we cannot
laboratory personnel?
Oh, sorry, I've got two people talking.
I think it's from my side. Let me just move from where they are.
Okay. There was a comment in the chat on instant strip tests available for food safety that can be done at the time of inspection. There are some instant tests. I don't know all about them. I'm not an analyst in terms of being able to provide that. You would need to work with your laboratory process and build that into your sampling program, so that you could say, for this tests, you're going to deal with that. It might be like pH, or I know about pH because it's been a while, they've been around for a while, but for chemical contamination and others, you would need to work with your laboratory to get the particular strips, make sure that they are part of your program and how they are going to be used. So it's not just, oh, I've got a strip, I'm going to use it. No, you want that to be considered a sample. Okay, Suzanne?
Right. Hope this is a little bit better. All right. Is there, I noticed it didn't say who must take the samples, but sometimes our lab personnel actually go in and take some of the monitoring. Well, they go and take some monitoring samples, right? Especially if there is a question whether the industry itself has a problem, and we go back in to do a sample. So the lab will do sample and the industry will take another set of sample and we compare it. What's your take on that?
Okay, so there's actually 2 or 3 questions in there. So maybe I can start out with the first one. In many countries, the laboratory and analysts go with the inspector to take the sample. In some cases, this is because the inspectors are not sufficiently trained on sampling, and therefore it is felt that the sampling procedures would be better implemented by a laboratory personnel. If that's the way it works in a particular country, that is not inappropriate. However, given the cost of having laboratory people confirmed and certified and working, it does in many instances seem to me that it's a fairly inefficient way to use laboratory staff. You could train inspectors better to do the sampling processes. You could even have clearly set out programs for training where lab staff and inspectors may go out and confirm they know how to do this. So in that sense, you need to make a decision on the training and the processes that are going to be applied by an inspector versus a lab staff. Having a lab staff go out and simply sample as part of the plan is also something that a country may decide to do. They may give all the what I call monitoring, so you have no problems, you don't believe you have any problems, you don't think you're going to get a non-compliance. All those samples may be picked up by a laboratory personnel if that's what the program says. It has to be determined on a country by country basis who's going to pick that up. Again, it really is a question of how do you want to make the most effective use of your resources? What you were talking about in terms of monitoring is what I call compliance sampling. In other words, I have a problem. I have a non-compliant sample. In that, and the results have come in and it's non-compliant. So I'm going to go back and resample. On the plant, again, this comes back to over time, your inspector is either trained enough to take these samples or is not trained enough to take these samples. In the sense of a laboratory going along with a sample or whatever, you make that as a policy decision. Who's going to take compliant samples? My recommendation would always be that the person who takes compliant samples is the same person who takes all the monitoring and surveillance samples. And the reason I say that is you do not want to bring any perception that the samples taken as part of monitoring, i.e. no problems, I'm just taking these as a representative sample of all the food businesses, or a surveillance, I think I have a problem and I may need to do a little more sampling. You don't want to use any perception that the person, this inspector, let's say, is doing the monitoring sampling and the surveillance sampling isn't trained or isn't sufficient or isn't actually capable. So you really want the same category of person doing all three levels of sampling. To be trained, absolutely. Having enough capacity, absolutely. But you really want the same category, like an inspector. If they're the sampling inspector, they should be able to do every level of sampling, even if there's a problem. It is very, last part of your question, it is very frequent that a company, especially big companies or companies that tend to distrust government, that a company will take the same, a similar sample or a sample from the same lot. The thing is, this is where you came back to your standards. In your sampling procedures, it is why you establish a standard. Okay. One of the most common standards is no salmonella found in a 25-gram sample. And there is a process of how you get to that 25 grams. So if your trained sampling inspector or personnel has taken the sample and they find the 25 gram, the salmonella in that 25 grams, it doesn't matter what else is found anywhere else. It doesn't matter how many samples are taken. You have breached your you have non-compliance. But it is why you need to have a very clear procedure and a process and a standard that can be explained. You know, if I'm sampling this lot, it has to be explained that, you know, micro is not homogeneous. It doesn't distribute 100% equally across a lot. So what you're saying then is, if I find it in this sample, I took 5 units, they were taken, other percentages of those units were taken to get 25 grams. We did the, and we went through an accredited lab, we did the process and we found salmonella. Then whether or not the sample that the food business took had salmonella in it or not, the lot's not acceptable. Conversely, if the sample that the food business took found salmonella and the sample that the government took did not find salmonella, the lot is still non-compliant. It is not based on who took the sample. It's based on the results of a sample. If you take 3 samples and one is compliant and the other 2 aren't, or 2 are compliant and 1 isn't, doesn't matter. That is a non-compliant lot. In some ways, it behooves the food business not to take the sample at the same time of the, and then they're not placing themselves into double jeopardy. That help? Clarify? Clear as mud?
Clear as mud.
It really is very hard, and it's that systematic approach to sampling, to establishing a sampling program, and then working through sampling guidance for every product you're sampling. If I'm sampling cheese, this is what I want, how I want it, where I want it, what I'm going to analyze it for, how the inspector's trained, how the results are assessed, and how they're disseminated to the right people. It's a complex process to get a sampling program up and running. This is a full week program in person. An absolute full week, not an hour. We do have, if you want me to do, Margarita, do you want me to do the exercises or?
Yeah, actually, before, wait, because it's a question of Susan.
Suzanne?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just one last question. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
Excellent, excellent.
In the labeling, I was reviewing it. My own concern is I have seen labels with the stamp of USDA on the labels for products. Is that part of a labeling requirement that is by law, or can the industry know that they have all their food safety standards in place, so they can just put the label to say that they are USDA inspected, or they're inspected by Canada or something?
Right, so what you're really talking about is some sort of import arrangement where you're talking about an imported food. So if an importer is bringing in a product from the US or from Canada, and it is required to have, by Jamaica, required to have a stamp from the exporting competent authority, then you should see a USFDA, a USDA, USFDA, either on the label or as a certificate. If Jamaica does not require that, then it should not be part of your label review. It's based on Jamaica's labeling standards and import standards. So for example, if Jamaica standard says every label must be in English, then if the product is not in English, it's illegal and should not be sold. So you want to set up a series of questions, and there is one in the manual. If you have an arrangement with the US that all beef sent to Jamaica from the US must have a USDA stamp, and there is a product without a USDA stamp, then it's illegal. It shouldn't be allowed in. It's not meeting your requirements. If you have a product that has a USDA stamp and it wasn't inspected by the USDA, then again, it's illegal because it essentially is fraudulent, giving itself as a perception that it had been inspected by the USDA and it wasn't. So you need to develop a series of questions on your labeling that are based on your standards for import, your arrangements with other countries, how the importer actually is going to bring that forward. And the similar thing for other Caribbean countries. There are many countries that require products to be reviewed and have free sales certificates. You could say that any product coming into Jamaica must have a free sales certificate in the country of origin. And that, again, you can build that into your standards and your inspection processes. Again, it's a step-by-step process so that you're very clear and you're consistent as you're approaching that.
Okay, so basically too, in the guidance document for the inspectors, our national labeling requirements should be in our inspector's book. Because if we see any product coming in with Chinese writing and there's no English in it, then it's really, as I said, should be detained or removed.
Yep. Let me just see if I can't publish that. I have something I will share. I think we go 141. Okay, so just because labeling has come up a couple of times, this is the sort of guidance you should have for labeling. And I've tried to put this down as a very, very step-by-step process. You can put it in a decision tree. I tend to write various documents. Is the language used on the label for mandatory requirements in the designated official languages? If you have 1 or 2 or 3, I put that in because in Canada there's 2, and maybe in someplace else there might be 1, there may be 3. Yes, you've got an answer. No, it's illegal. Okay, it shouldn't be allowed to be imported and it shouldn't be allowed to be sold. Okay, there are rework. Common name. Is the common name present on the label as per mandatory requirements? Is it acceptable? And then you simply go through. Is it in a place that's visible? Is there a net quantity declaration? These are generally things that Codex has set out in standards that should be on a label. And you just go step by step. And how you would deal with it. Is there a list of ingredients? Does Jamaica require a list of ingredients? Yes, continue. Here's where you start getting much more work. Are any of the ingredients listed considered prohibited in Jamaica? Are they used the right names and terms? Because something that's the right term in Canada may not be the same as in the US, may not be the same as in the EU, it may not be the same as in Jamaica. Okay, and in certain areas, I've also put into some sort of inspection strategy. Is it legible? I mean, if you see, font that's about this size, there's no way that a consumer is going to be able to read it. So you're still looking at legibility as well. Is there the name of the responsible food business as per law? Date marking if required? Storage conditions as required? If it's imported, country of origin? Is it required and is it declared? So these are all things in terms of a step-by-step process for a label review that should be easily available to the inspectors, and especially the biggies. Language, yes, no. Those are easy ones. And an inspection strategy can be built around those for imports. You can't come in if you don't have the right language on. one of the things that sometimes complicates factors is that there's often a separate organization that deals with standards and deals with labeling. That doesn't mean that an inspector who doesn't have all of the requirements for labeling, all of the authorities, can't simply say, this is illegal, you can't sell it until and detain it until it can be undertaken from a review. You can look at your different authorities and say, okay, who can get the biggest ones, you know, common name, country of origin, language, who can deal with those, and then who needs to deal with the list of ingredients in the proper orders, nutritional labeling, and the other more technical reviews in a different way. So those are two options and two strategies that you can bring out with regard to label review. But I would recommend that every inspector be trained on the minimal legal type of processes for label review and have the guidance documents available.
Question.
Yes.
Well, I was wondering about that, and I was thinking of asking, but that if an FSPID inspector, well, or Act and Regulation don't cover labeling. So I was wondering if an inspector in conducting an inspection sees improper labeling. I was thinking that because our Act and Regulations do not cover labeling, it would be, for want of a better word, illegal for us to detain goods just because it was improperly labeled, and that instead we would want to contact the relevant authority to conduct an inspection.
There's two things here, okay? And you may need to actually get a legal review and ask, it's very important to ask the right question in these sorts of instances. You may not have legal authority specified in your regulation. However, if you let it go, you are knowingly aiding and abetting and allowing an illegal product that you know is illegal into the country. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. This can be addressed in a number of ways, in particular for, let's say, an import inspector, by being cross-designated as a labeling review for specific sections. So for example, if there is in your labeling a law that has particular requirements for labeling and language, common name, and responsible agent are the three major ones. You might have a cross designation or an MOU or an arrangement that says where you are doing an inspection of import product at an importer and you see any one of those things illegal, they don't meet your standard, you will detain it until a full name the inspection services inspector can come up. Or you may even be, if you are cross designated under the law, you can be designated for a certain part of the law, and therefore you will have the authority to detain until the labelings are corrected. There are a number of ways to deal with that, but when you're dealing with the legal policy, you want to say, we want to be able to address these illegal issues that we see. How can we do it? You don't want to say, can I? Because they'll say no. They're very risk adverse. You want to say, how do we do it? And move forward on those areas. Okay, it is a very difficult issue where you have multiple food inspections services. You know, if health sees something that it needs to be addressed by agriculture and they don't have that specific requirement in their law, do they call? Do they take action? And where does it end up when the inspector doesn't take action and you essentially have an illegal product on the market? Very, 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 very difficult legal concepts to address.
Thank you.
lots of food for thought, I'm sure. Other comments or questions? Boy, I'm sure there's a lot of things. Yes,
So-
Margarita.
Before we go to the breakout rooms, actually, I would like to steal a few minutes of everyone because I would like to take a picture from all the participants and the speaker. And I would like to ask you, please, if you can open your cameras for a picture. Maybe I should say yesterday, to be more prepared, but well, I think spontaneous things are best. So, hello everyone, nice to see you.
Nice to see everybody, rather
Yes.
than just names.
Yeah, this it feels less robotic, no, or less virtual when everyone is there. So let's wait a minute for a few other people to open their cameras. I see some people with the masks. I guess they are in their offices. Good. So step by step, there is more people. Okay. I'm taking the picture, please smile. Okay. Okay, once more. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. We will share it also. And thank you.
Thank you. So the other part of, I don't think we're going to have sufficient time to do the full group, but what I was hoping when we were, oops, sharing a different screen. What I had been hoping to do was have a discussion on in groups, but I don't think we have enough time to go through all of it. On what you're currently doing versus what you would want to do in terms of future sampling program. So when I was explaining that there was this concept of having a certain number of systematic approaches with regard to sampling, do you currently have a national program that addresses all of your foods, imported, domestic, what you're sampling for? Is it something you would like in the future? Suzanne?
All right, we have a national residue program because we are meeting the EU market.
Yep.
So that is there, but the other microbial or other sampling in the different areas, we don't have a national approach. So it'd be nice to have a national plan. Like now we're developing our AMR national plan for the livestock sector. So it'd be nice that we have more national plans in the future.
Anyone else? Comments?
With regard to FSPID, I would say we do have a plan where our inspectors are, asked to take X amount of samples per week, per month, whatever, in terms of monitoring. But it's certainly not as formal as you have described. So I think we can take a lot from what you have shown us this morning in improving our sampling plan.
I'm just doing this to try and help. So yes, one of the areas is that a number of countries have said, yes, an inspector needs to take sample of the month club almost. You know, I have to take so many samples every week, every month. The real issue is then is how do you structure that weekly sampling, monthly sampling, to make sure you're addressing your highest risk issues and that you can use those as part of your analysis to improve year over year. Do break down your samples by monitoring, surveillance, compliance, monitoring being where you're addressing areas that have no known issues, surveillance where you think there might be a problem, but you're not sure the extent, and compliance where you know you have a problem and you're addressing it. Do you generally break down your samples by type?
I would say ours are just broken down into monitoring / surveillance, I don't know if I can say that, versus when we see or when we suspect something is wrong.
All right, for MOA, we do it according to sectors. So we do it for aquaculture. I tell you, we do each EU market and US market. We do it for cattle. So we have our TB and brucellosis program. We have it for pigs. We have it for poultry. If we have these diseases, African swine fever, avian influenza.
So these are the areas of just as you're moving from your sampling by week per month to sample as a strategic approach to how you want to move forward on your sampling programs. You know, if you don't have the disease or hasn't been around for a while, do you want to do less? You may simply want to have a minimal amount of monitoring, or you may want to target most of those towards imports rather than in the domestic. So these are all ways you can start to build the plan to use the resources that you have to the most important areas that you need to sample.
And some of these programs we have now are joint with Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Health. In the future, we'd like to strengthen that partnership because we have a whole lot of sampling to do, especially when it comes to foodborne illnesses.
One of the ways of strengthening the collaboration is also about sharing the results on an annual basis. So if you have a limited number of samples that you can take, and I think a couple of times that was mentioned over the inspection training, you know, if you've got all of the samples that are taken by every inspection service, whether it's the FSPID, MOA, MOH, whether it's even municipal, if there is any way you can get industry samples as part of that, then you again get more samples that you can use in a strategic analysis to identify any problems that may come up. In some countries, and not all of them, there is a mandatory requirement for the industry to provide the sample results to the government. In some of these instances, it is only for non-compliant samples. In others, it is for all samples. Sometimes it's on a monthly basis with non-compliant samples being identified immediately, but overall you need to get all samples provided. Again, what you're simply trying to see is that where you have a limited amount of resources, and in many cases, the government laboratory is the one that is giving the resources or the analytical resources to the industry to, or assigning certain percentage of resources for industry use. So being able to integrate those results into your sampling programs can expand your capacity to understand the profile, the microbial profiles, the pathogens, the chemical, the issues around that. Again, who does the pesticide analysis at the farm? Who manages the pesticides? Is there a specific agency? I don't think it's FSPID, is it?
FSPID does some amount of pesticide residue testing.
You do some. Are you responsible for determining which pesticides are used, approval, et cetera, et cetera?
On farms,
at the farm
no,
level?
No.
No.
No, that's Ministry of Health.
Okay.
Pesticide Control Authority does the overall approval for pesticides in the country.
So using either whatever FSPID is doing, any of the Minister of Health pesticide approval processes, and having collaboration around that can also minimize or make more effective use of some of the pesticide residue sampling, which is quite expensive when you're moving it.
I think what happened, Marianne, is that the results, you spoke about it this morning, I think we don't really do that. We collect the samples, we give it to the lab, but a proper feedback to the inspectors and to the different agencies might be what we need to implement.
Yeah.
We try to do a full contaminant database, but I don't think it's contaminants we want. We just want a normal reporting system. So if you want to know, okay, everything's good, you can find anything or it's in the range or whatever, I think that's what we need to move towards.
In the Canadian process, they have two sampling programs. One is called the microbiological monitoring program. One is called the chemical monitoring program. And they also work on areas, they publish their results. The summaries are published on the web. The more detailed ones, you simply have to write and they'll send you the results. They are able to publish things that said, you know, and sometimes it's done on what I call a project basis. So they have a concern about aflatoxin in corn. And then after they've done all their processes, they will come back and say, we took 500 samples across Canada of this, and it was 98% compliant. So when you're getting to that level of analysis, you can start to say, you know, we sampled across the food chain on so-and-so for such and such pesticides, and it was 95% compliant. You will need, as you're moving into your environmental assessment system, situation analysis, you will need to go much more in depth about which product and where and how and whether it's imported. But being able to provide some high level summaries of what you were doing or why also gives your senior managers, politicians, understanding that you are using the resources that were given for inspection and analysis in a way that is giving results for food safety. It's all, that's really what it's about, is the government gives you resources and you want to be able to show, yep, you're making a difference, both in the sampling and analysis and in the inspection side. So for the annual sampling plans, do you actually develop your plans in negotiation with your labs and inspection staff? Or is this done by one or the other?
Say that again, Marianne.
How do you develop your annual sampling plans? Do you develop it by laboratories, or do you develop by inspection staff, or is it in negotiation? Eben?
Yes, I wouldn't. It's not. I wouldn't say developed annually. It's more, for want of a better word, whenever we see an issue, the labs and the inspectors will collaborate to address the issue of number of samples and so on. But it's not. We don't sit down annually and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. So, as I said before, our plan needs more structure.
Yeah, I'm not going to. It's just and even issue by issue is what. When you're doing an issue by issue approach, you're doing it for compliance monitoring, not compliance monitoring, compliance enforcement samples. The way I try and explain it is the annual plan basically has three components of monitoring, surveillance, and compliance. So what you're dealing with is your issue by issue basis is compliance sampling, where you have a problem and you're trying to sample to find out the extent and resolve it and find the issues. Yeah. Anybody else about annual sampling plans or?
For Ministry of Agriculture, Vet Services, I don't think we have a sit-down written annual sampling plan. We do, most of our samples come from quality assurance, which is what I learned this morning from you. Industry sending their samples and we monitor them. Actual developing monitoring surveillance plan now is something that we will have to do. The thing, Marianne, that monitoring surveillance programs is government funded, and you know that is going to be one of the biggest issues.
So if you're looking at the government is funding the quality assurance, in other words, you're taking a sample for the industry, sending it to a government lab, that resource should fundamentally be reassigned to doing a monitoring surveillance programming. You may end up taking the same sample, in other words, from the same food businesses, more or less, but you will analyze that at a national basis to say, am I taking the right samples? That's the problem here, is that when I'm doing a one-to-one food business inspector lab and backwards, back to the food business, you're not necessarily using the right resources to analyze it strategically. So maybe you're taking samples from a food business that is one of the best food businesses for controlling all the issues that you're trying to sample from. And maybe you should be taking more from the one that's a little bit iffy to get a better handle on the entire industry, as opposed to only using it for those good food businesses. So you may end up still sampling there, but you may be using it more strategically in how you approach it.
All right, then Marianne, if we're taking the samples,
Yep.
we already have the results from the industry. Can't that go a part of our data collection?
Yes. If
And
the industry is taking their own samples, analyzing their own samples, and is prepared to give it to you, you absolutely should use it in your strategic analysis.
all right, but if the industry is taking the samples and we are analyzing it, that can be part of our monitoring surveillance program, or we have to go out there and take the samples ourselves?
You need to be assured, if the industry is actually taking the sample and sending it to the lab, so you have access to the resources. The critical issue is ensuring that they are following the same level of structured sampling techniques that the inspector would do. One of the areas that is of perception or problems of perception is that the industry might try and ensure that it is only providing samples that are going to pass. If you have 3 lots they can sample, and they're going to sample the one they know is perfect. You know, the one that's been, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to my drop on the floor. The piece of meat that's been dropped on the floor and dipped in chlorine so that you know you're not going to get microbial samples. Those are the concerns that I would have with a full industry developed sampling plan. Sorry, a full industry only submission of samples. You could then do, if you're still inspecting those places, you could say, well, every other one that when I come and do my inspection, I'm going to sample it. It still allows them to have their quality assurance processes through that process. You could also simply monitor if you're there when they're taking a sample, are they doing it correctly? How are they doing this representative sampling as opposed to targeted or random where they're trying to pick it up? So those are the questions. Are they actually getting a septic technique? Are they trained on it? Are they actually picking up what they should be picking up? So those are all questions you want to make sure that you're addressing if the industry continues to provide the samples. You know, the other, one of the problems that happens with samples, especially when you're doing monitoring a representative, is you may not be able to get to that industry, that particular food plant, because there's other things that are going on. If you have sufficient confidence in the industry and they take the samples and they may even take it to the laboratory and you use it, that's fine. It's always a question of confidence in the processes and the procedures so you can have confidence in the results. And that's the same whether it's done by an inspector or a business an employee, because if the inspector isn't trained, as some of you have mentioned, they're not going to be able to deliver in the way that they should be delivering this sample, and therefore you can have confidence in the results. I did one training, assuming not good for me, that I was just having them demonstrate the processes, because of course they've been trained on it. When I got up to actually put all the actual technical stuff out to show them how to have them do aseptic technique of sampling, trier, various other things, there was just complete silence. And the only comment was, Marianne, you do it, because we don't know how to. So you really need to be able to understand who is trained. Are they trained sufficiently? And do you have confidence in that training being applied so that you're going to have confidence in the results? We're getting through this. Is there a documented process for sampling that tells every inspector what they have to sample, where, when, for what?
Oh, sorry, then Marianne, in the future then, sorry, for the annual sampling plan,
Yeah.
by lab and inspector, we would have to do that by agency so
Yeah.
that we can negotiate, as you said, and then we perhaps can add it to a national sampling plan. So we know every agency is doing planned sampling for these items.
You can
What do you
do
think?
it. Yeah, you can do it two ways. You can set your program. This is your high level, what you're going to sample. So I want to do poultry for a particular vet drug. I want to do jerk chicken at restaurants. I'm just going to make this up, okay? I want to do water. I want to do milk. And I want to do fish for my export market. So now I have 5 products that is on my program level. I've set up, these are my products, and this is what I'm saying I want them analyzed for. You could have your 3 agencies say, okay, MOA is going to do the fish, they're going to do the chicken, MOH is going to do the jerk chicken, and then within the agency's responsibility, they could set out their annual plan, and you could sit down as a whole to negotiate it. You know, maybe it'll be the 3 agencies. One will do the jerk chicken, one will do the chicken for a vet drug, one will do the fish for export. you could all be in the same room together. I don't think you're talking about thousands of people. You're probably talking about 10, maybe a half dozen. You know, there's nothing to say once you've set your program out at the higher level, which products for which analysis, and then divvy them up by agency, that you sit in the same room and negotiate them. So you can either do it by agency and roll it up, or you can do it at high level and roll it down or drill down.
Okay.
So there's two ways to do it. How you do it, how it works for you is what's best.
I think we have to start small. I think all agencies need to develop this plan, and then we can all come to the table.
Sometimes it's easiest to start with one product. Okay. And sometimes the reason it's easiest is you're trying to develop the process. So, and again, because you guys raised it over the time, jerk chicken. It's a really important foodstuff. Working through the process, even though FSPID may not have a responsibility for it, having them sit in the process of how you work through this may be useful so that everybody's getting the same process. You might even need to have a procedure written down that says, this is how we choose, you know, we get to our program, and this is the step-by-step process. So you might choose 3 products, one that FSPID is responsible for, one MOH is responsible for, one MOA, and then work through those procedures and end up with an SOP for identifying how you develop your program and identifying how you develop the negotiate the processes. I have 2 hands up, Debbie, and then I'll go to Winifred.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm thinking for the future, they could also have a standardized procedure as to how they go about taking their samples.
Absolutely. That's what this is. The exact process for how to take your sample should be written in your sampling procedure is the detailed guidance under a sampling plan. So your program is high level. Your plan is what I'm going to do this year, the what, the where, the when, and then underneath it, there is specific guidance for each sample to be taken. And you do need an SOP. It's not, I have written some for generic ones for some countries. And believe me, it is how much stuff you have to think about. What you're going to get in the way of, you know, a sampling, you know, do you need a trier? Do you need a hygrometer for your adulteration? Do you need gloves? What do you need to put in terms of specific guidance that the equipment the inspector needs? All of that. And when you start writing it, you realize how detailed you have to get. You are talking about an SOP for every single sample that is taken. So it's not a turnaround on a dime and I'm going to write it. Okay. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is something that's got to be developed and very, very, very time and resource intensive to write it. Once you've written one, and once you get a full lot list done, then you're only tweaking around the corner for the next ones. Winifred?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just wanted to say that obviously we have a lot of work to do. I do think, though, that it is possible, particularly if we're starting with just a few food items. Already, Ministry of Health and Agriculture collaborates around sampling, particularly as it relates to brucellosis and certainly for select organisms in the seafood industry. So it is possible for SOPs to be developed around that particular system that we have. I wanted to point out as well that it is going to be very important how we engage industry, because one of the proposals is that we could enter into, well, not so much enter into an arrangement, but we could treat sample results that originates from the company as an area of non-compliance. And so for that, we would have to sit down with industry for industry to fully understand that whether the non-compliance was detected by a sample submitted by the inspectors or by the company itself, it will be treated as the same. A non-compliance is a non-compliance identified by whomever. That is perhaps where we will have quite a bit of work to do as well, because industry, while they're accustomed to us reviewing their records and all of that, we don't normally treat their results as part of the decision-making process. So clearly, there is going to be quite a bit of work we have to do. I think too, in terms of the approach, it would be very good if agency by agency, and certainly within our stakeholder groups, because there are areas where we, for instance, collaborate with MOA in meetings, and perhaps the other agencies could be brought in so that we have the general stakeholder group. And I think we need to examine very carefully what we do, because as the operators in the field, oftentimes we understand the issues and the nuances. And so I think we could begin quite early by doing the work individually and then collectively, so that we can inform the national level, so that even if the policy comes out of the national level, at least it would have done that based on our submissions.
Yeah, there are, sorry. When you're looking at planning processes, there really are two types of planning processes. One is from the bottom up and one is from the top down. And possibly the first most effective is one that uses both. So as inspectors are out in the field and they're collecting samples and they're looking at products and they're hearing consumer complaints, there can be a process by which the inspectors can gather the recommendations for sampling in the upcoming year. And then this can be across agencies, it can be across parishes, it can be just gathered. And then there can be a discussion, let's say it's senior specialists or supervisors, or even national analysis sort of program managing process of what is feasible. Maybe there were 100 things that were put up from the inspectors, and there's a discussion on what's the highest priority. So yes, the bottom up, having that inspector knowledge and understanding and putting up the things that should be in the sampling plan would be part of your environmental scanning. Okay, so this is about saying, what does the inspector hearing on the ground and should be coming up? What are the results of the analysis? Out of 100 samples, we're 100% compliant, 98 or 20%. Does that make a difference on what I sample for this year? That discussion with industry is really important. Because if you are taking those industry, both compliant and non-compliant samples, and putting them into your environmental scan, which is what you're really going to be doing, you're taking the totality of industry results and saying, we're going to look at them to see whether there's a trend analysis that over time, any particular industry, any particular plant, any particular product either was improving in compliance or reducing or going down. The compliance was going down. So that's part of what I call environmental scanning or situation, is analyzing the data you have that's accessible. And you do need to tell industry if you're going to use that data on a national basis. Most of the time when you go to data on a national basis, you remove all identities. So even though it came from food business A, B, or C, the discussion would be about sector information and data, not about a food business data. It is only when you get to compliance and enforcement that you're probably going to be working with a specific food business in terms of using that information. Again, while you look at industry data for non-compliance, you really want to make sure that if the information, the sample that the industry submitted comes back as non-compliance, you really, really, really want to make sure they took appropriate action. Your laws probably have something that they're not allowed to sell product that isn't in compliance. And if they sold that product, you have immediate evidence that they are not prepared to sell a safe food. And you need to be able to take action on that right away. But absolutely, and in some cases, the industry may, if you have industry associations that you can talk to about your sampling plan, about environmental scanning, about anything that they're hearing, they can be a very good ally because they want to export. Most of these industries want to export either to the EU or to the US or to other countries. And if there's a way to demonstrate that they have good compliance, that such that they can share that with their importers in another country, you know, there's a program, there's a monitoring residue program, there's a microbiological monitoring, your HACCP, you're monitoring to ensure that the industry samples are taken into account. They may have a bigger ability to sell, and they could be your best allies. So I'm not going to go any further on that. So is there anything else that you want to raise with regard to sampling or any other program? Any other comments or questions?
You want to do the next column, Maria?
Which column? This one?
Yes, that
Sure.
one.
So in terms of the reason, this is a follow-up on the environmental set, the row before. If you have an environmental scanning situational analysis or analysis of what you've done or what's happening, then the next step is really saying, are there foods that I want to take off the sampling plan, the annual sampling plan? Are there foods I want to move from monitoring to monitoring to surveillance? Somebody mentioned earlier the concept, the joint programs and some of the disease areas. So if there's not just foodborne illnesses, but also animal diseases that are coming up, are there other programs that need to be addressed here? And then you would go in and change your targeted foods. So maybe you're dropping cheese and you're picking up yogurt. Maybe you're dropping chicken and you're picking up more beef, or lowering chicken and you're picking up beef. So this is around taking the instructions you gave to inspectors last year and saying, and looking at your sampling plan and saying, do I need to change anything? So do you currently do that?
I just have a concern because this is going to be a very, 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 very long list, because we can get so many different foods from one cut, if you understand what I mean. From milk, we can get different products. So do we have to do for every single food item, or can we start off first in like a group, milk-based products, fish-based products, beef-based products, if you understand what I mean? Unprocessed, further processed. How you think we could tackle this? Because we want to be able to start something. How do we start? That's my question.
Yeah, okay. So you cannot sample everything. You cannot sample all food products. So what you do is you start with your food profile. And that generally is, sorry, this probably should go on the next slide. So when you're talking about the food profile, you're saying what foods are consumed. right? You want to say, you know, Jamaicans eat what? Okay. How much of each one? If, let's say, yogurt or kefir is like down at the bottom of the list, you might be starting with UHT milk, or you might be starting with pasteurized. So you try and have that discussion about what foods are consumed. What are the high risk foods? You know, so volume. If at this point you have any association with food illnesses, you might bring it in as a high risk food here. You may go back to your, remember in our inspection risk categorization. Sorry. One of the factors are foods. You may use that as your priority, use that list in starting your process. So you need to make some concept, and this is where you actually set your program. You start off saying, we want to look at the highest risk foods, which is volume and risks associated with illnesses or bacterial contamination. That's how we want to start for Jamaica, whether they're imported or domestic. We want to start with those. And we want to monitor them. And you might just choose, let's say, 3 foods the first year. You might choose 10 foods, whatever you want to choose. You would choose it, and then you would work through step by step. What are, if in those 3 foods, what are we going to assess it for? So let's say milk. Milk's a big, big one in Jamaica. You want to do pasteurized milk. Okay. What in that are you actually going to test for? That you can't do via that is a confirmation or something that you can't get via your inspection. Okay. You could, if the industry is dealing with, does analysis to ensure that there's enough heat and temperature, time temperature requirements to make sure that the product is pasteurized, and they're doing that, you might simply say, we're going to take those data. So then you're saying, well, what else do we want? Well, yogurt's a problem. We know that people eat a lot of yogurt, and it may not be made of pasteurized milk or something like that. So you might say, okay, milk, we can get enough of the information that we need via inspection. We don't need to make that the highest priority. So then let's say you're having fish, okay, and you're dealing with vet drugs. I'm just picking this up. So you've gone through milk, and you're going, inspection is the best way to go. We can get all the pasteurization data. From industry. So I don't need to spend my very scarce resources doing milk right now. I may do it down the road, but right now. So fish for vet drugs, I need it for certification. But I have thousands of fish products. So now you're looking at, this is your rationale. Remember, I said you always have a reason. I need it for certification. So I might look at the EU. What's the percentage of fish going there? You know, figure out which are the highest products that are going for export. What are the, is it in the vet residue? What's the percentage of lots that have to be sampled? For what vet drugs? Okay. So now I've got my rationale for sampling is certification to the EU. We want to get the highest volume of products that's going out that I'm certifying as the #1 priority. They have a vet residue program that they look at when they come in to audit other third-party countries. So you want to look at that program to say, what's the percentage that they want done? What are the samples they need done? And what are the residues? And if they have a sample analysis, are we using the right analysis for them? So this way you're starting to say, that's a third program. I'm going to go back to my jerk chicken. Because it's a very high priority, high consumption in Jamaica. So what do I want to deal with it? It's sold off food carts. It could be abused. Could be subject. I want to do micro. Now you want to say, are we doing indicator? Are we doing pathogens? And why? What information will each result give me? Do you still want to do association with temperature control? You know, so you may include, so for example, for every sample, they have to record, the inspector records temperature at time sampled. And you're saying the rationale is I want to correlate what I'm finding in the jerk chicken vis-a-vis what the temperature was when it was being sampled. But these are the sorts of very detailed step-by-step process. You have hundreds of foods. Why are you sampling that one? And what's it going to give you as a result? Remember, at the end of the day or the end of the year, you will have, let's say, 1,000 results. And you're going to be able to say that with confidence, you know, not, you know, the program, the vet residue program is 99% compliant. That every food sampled for vet residue is 99% compliant. So that's a real, you know, so you can then say if they come over the last 3 years, the residue analysis as built in this process was 99% compliant, or 96 to 99% compliant. If you run into problems with food cart, let's say your food cart with your jerk chicken is 75% compliant. Now you go back and look at the analysis and say, what can we do to bring that compliance up? This is not done simply for analysis sake. It's not simply to say what it is, it's what can we do? So maybe it's more education. Maybe it's more inspection of temperature controls. Maybe it's just more inspection, period. But you see, you're really looking at how I'm going to analyze the data I get as part of your discussion on how you're going to what samples you want to pick up. You want to know what you're going to end up with, the rationale for sampling. I want to be able to determine the compliance, the percent compliance of food being sold to the Jamaican population. Therefore, I want to understand and take a representative number of samples of X food for Y hazard, so I can have a good understanding of what the level of compliance is in those food samples. Yes, it's a ton of work. It is a lot of work. It is not going to be, I would say it's a multi-year project. Did I give you too much information?
No,
No?
no,
Okay.
no, we just take it
No.
one step at a time.
Yes,
No, you didn't.
exactly. Exactly. And you may only want to start, as I said, with 1 or 2 or 3 foods at the beginning. One of the things I would recommend as you're going through this process is to very clearly balance out domestic and imports. And the reason I strongly suggest this is coming back to your discussions with industry comments. If you are simply doing domestic foods, you can get into this concept of you're harder on domestic than you are on imports. If you can balance out both, then you can show or demonstrate that you are taking equally, or not equally, but at least some sort of balance between the 2 sorts of foods. Because domestic industries tend to get very protective over their market share. And if they believe the import has an advantage, it makes for a lot of tense situations with the inspectors and or managers. You know, and as I said here, if you have a situation where you want data and you can better get it from the inspection, put it in the inspection. Don't do it as analysis. Tailor your analysis for the products that you absolutely cannot get any other way, using the highest risks first. Comments?
I think the next one, what you said, developing sampling guidance for inspectors, I think we need to work on that.
It really is important for consistency. You know, you don't want to have perception can be very important here. Again, the world has changed so dramatically from 30, 40, 50 years ago. You know, what used to happen in some of the fish programs in Canada was they would go out to sample, often things like lobster, high-end fish, and they would come back and have a sample. And then they would stick it in the freezer and use that for Christmas parties as part of the food for Christmas parties. You can imagine how poorly that went over when industry learned of it. So you want guidance not only to say what you're picking up so that everybody picks up the same thing. You want to know how it's going to be disposed of. Your guidance is, so you don't have this perception that maybe an inspector is picking something up for their own purposes, that they can take their sampling guidance and say, look, this is what I'm doing. This is what I've been asked to do. I need 5 samples. I need 10 samples. I need 5 for micro and 10 for chemistry. It's going to this lab. If you want to follow up, you can follow up. It's an education that every single time the sample is taken, so that there is this concept that you're consistent and that you can explain to the industry where the samples are going and how they're going to be used. In actual fact, that's a good point. I don't think I've dealt with in any of my guidance documents for inspectors disposal. But there should be I think the laboratories may have it as part of the accreditation of how they dispose, how they hold on to and how they dispose samples. But that's something that should be available too. So you can tell inspectors. It's a work in progress. That's why I sort of suggest doing 2 or 3. And after you work through it, once you get a format, it's easier to just fill the format out after and say, oh, we need to change this or we don't need to change that. It's good. Other comments?
I just want to thank you, Marianne, for that excellent point on disposal.
Yeah.
It certainly has been an issue for some individuals. We do have a protocol, however, which we normally advise them of, but it is an important question that has to be answered.
Yes, and in some cases, the laboratory protocol is the one that needs to be used. Like if I'm taking a sample and I'm sending, 5 subsamples to the laboratory, it may be the laboratory that's going to dispose of it, not the inspector, and that needs to be clearly explained as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's really important, and it may even be that if you're taking samples back to, let's say, an inspection office where you can have more control over what you're doing in the way of, let's say, pH, adulteration, or even label reviews. It may be that occasionally you'll want to bring in an industry to show them what you're doing and how you dispose of it, just to make sure that it's clear. That you're not using it for anything other than what you intended, which was inspection or analysis.
I just want to share as well that there is actually a disposal certificate that we issue.
Yeah. Again, it's anything to ensure that there's this concept that food inspectors are following processes. They have been well trained. They understand the issues. They're not out to mess with the industry. They're out to protect food safety. You are professional people, and there's nothing worse than the type of smear or inference that you're not doing your jobs because industry has a perception of wrongdoing. Comments? Antoinette, you have your hand up, so.
Yes, I have heard of cases where inspectors, they collect free samples, or the proprietors give it to them free. And I've heard of cases where persons actually use the health department's money and purchase it, the sample. Is there any guidance surrounding that?
Okay, let me try the first one first. No inspector should accept any sort of gift from a food business for which they have responsibility. This is the whole concept of potential perception, conflict of interest. No matter whether or not there is a conflict of interest, the perception on accepting gifts or samples for an inspector's personal use is definitely a no-no. It's a no-no in Codex, and you will see it around the world and becoming much more explicit that no inspector should accept a gift. And sometimes it's against culture. And certainly I remember when I started, gifts were quite common from the industry to the inspector, but it's becoming totally not acceptable anymore. There's just too many communications and too many people involved where, oh yes, he accepts gifts all the time. He does that. Now, a gift of having a cup of coffee, the US takes it to an extreme where inspectors can't even accept a cup of coffee. That's not what but you need to give the magnitude. Anything under $1, $2 within a normal relationship, like a coffee, this time I buy you a coffee, next time you buy me a coffee, that's fine. But an actual physical gift, whether it's simply a sample or not, can lead to a very bad perception of conflict of interest. Okay, so to the extent possible, you should be looking at developing HR policies that says, or even under remember at the very first day, we talked about compliance and enforcement policy and principles. That should be one of the principles. You should not accept gifts, and you shouldn't have in any way subject to the conflict of any perception of conflict of interest. The second one is buying samples versus taking samples. And this one's a very hard one because it really needs you to look at laws, and it needs you also to consider hardship for your food businesses. So if you're sampling with as association with an inspection, or you're going to a food business or anything like that, it's very often acceptable practice that the samples are taken without being paid for. The problem, it sort of goes down from there, because when you're into a big retail like your Macy's or your supermarkets or anything like that, they're not going to miss, again, you're not going to miss 5 units that you're taking for a sample and analysis process. Where it gets really starting to be difficult is when you're talking about a very small business and you still need to sample them as part of your program and plan, and whether or not it's going to be too much of a hardship and you should buy them. Often it's simply as much of a hardship for the inspection service to buy them. So these are areas where you have to have a good discussion on what your law requires, where the legal process is, what's moral vis-a-vis samples versus taking them versus buying them. Is there any programs that can be used to assist in making sure that you're getting the representative samples without overburdening the food business that you're taking it from? These are all complex issues. To the extent possible, my recommendation is, unless you actually have a legal requirement to purchase foods for sample and analysis, I would be going, to the extent possible, with the ability to take it for free, mainly because it costs an enormous amount to any inspection service if they must buy thousands and thousands of food samples. Another area that you may wish to have a policy around purchase versus sampling versus how much you take is where you have very, very expensive products that are packaged in fairly large containers. And the one that comes to mind is caviar. It's almost always packaged in, 5, 6, 7 kilo. It can be quite a large amount. You may need to have specific guidance around how you address that, because importers get extremely, talking from experience, extremely upset when you have to take 5 units of a very, very high-end product to do a micro test. Now you're talking thousands of dollars, and that's when you can actually run into problems, because in the future they start saying, no, you can't take it, you have to buy it, and you can run into problems. So you need to get some guidance around that, whether you're taking it, you're simply sampling it without payment, or you're sampling with payment, and what happens at the high end of the scale when there's a lot of money involved in a sample. Good.
Okay.
Tons of stuff to think of. Please don't ever believe that I'm trying to say this is simple. It's complex. It's going to create its own problems as you roll it out, not because you don't have the best intention of the world, but you forget details or somebody interpreted something a little bit different. Any other comments or questions?
No, just for the last one, that we would need to have some kind of MOU to get lab results so we can do analysis, because we still have this thing that labs are not allowed to give out information or something like that.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons that labs tend not to give out the data is because there's still a lot of commercial or private data associated with it, like the name of the company. You don't need the name of the company or any of that for the analysis. What you need is, this is the product, this is what it was analyzed for, and this is the result. Because you're really trying to get that high level % compliance for a particular product, for a particular hazard. And so again, the MOU might be saying they clean off all the identification data and just give you the raw data dump on how they deal with it and what the results were. Sorry, that begs the question, are the labs not part of MOH or MOA, or are they separate entity?
All agencies have their own labs here.
Okay, so each lab should be able to provide the data to the agency with which it's associated. I'm struggling with this, the data, the labs not being able to provide the data. I really am struggling with the concept. The laboratories are funded by the government.
Yes. So what will happen also is that it has to go to our EPI unit. EPI unit normally gives you the results or the analysis of what they're picking up. So it's not a straight lab analysis alone. We have EPI units that actually gather the information and then analyze it and give you the report. So if the MOU, it has to be all areas that do reporting would have to sit down and come together and make a decision of what we're going to do with it.
So you need to have, if I'm understanding this correctly, you need to have an MOU for how you get the data, because you want the raw data. You don't want a report, because the EPI unit probably is looking for specific things that pertain to their responsibilities, as opposed to looking at the entire data. So you can say the fish that went to EU was 99% compliant. That's a different analysis than what an EPI unit might do. Am I correct?
That's true.
Yeah.
We do have a surveillance network that do reports, but as I said, it goes to the EPI unit, so they would tell you how many persons were affected or how many animals were affected or something like that. But the raw data, no.
And again, how much you get on how many people are affected may not be what, is not what you want for an inspection or a sampling program. In a food safety investigation, absolutely, you need to have some understanding of that. But for a pure sampling program to look at compliance, there may be, what you are looking for is 0 people ever affected in those programs. You want this 100% compliant. Doesn't generally work that way, but 95, 96, 97, 98% compliance is where you're targeting. So you might have, even the non-compliance may not have got out the door of the food business. So there will be no people affected. So that's what you want the data for, is to be able to determine where you're going to put your efforts next year. You don't want it filtered through an EPI or a surveillance unit. You want it coming as sufficient data. So yes, an MOU would be perfect, would be something you want to address so that you can get the data without identity, but enough so you can do the analysis. So that's a good idea. And then you may want to even have an MOU among the agencies to say what level of data you can share between the 3, 4, 5 agencies, whatever you have. Because some laboratories may say, yes, we can give it to you because you're part of MOH, but we can't give the raw data to MOA. So MOH may have to do the first level of analysis for the products that their laboratory did, and then talk about the analysis, the result of those analysis, rather than the raw data with MOA. These are things you're going to have to work out because they're going to be very specific to Jamaica in the way you're structured and organized. Other comments or questions? We've gone through a ton of information.
I just have to say thank you. It has been a whole lot. It would be good if we could implement some of these things. It definitely will help our inspection. How we carry out our inspection. It would be excellent. But thank you very much.
You're very welcome. If there's no other comments or questions, I certainly will. I want to thank all of you for your interest and your certainly for your participation and the fascinating discussion. I always say when I do these sorts of training, I learn a lot every single time. So thank you so much. And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Margarita.
Yes, Maria, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for this training, these 2 weeks. We are almost a family by now, so because it's like everyday meeting with each other. So I hope again that the training was fruitful, and we will be sharing all the recordings, and I think you have already the documents, but we can send all together that you keep them with you. And also, actually, we would like to send a survey just to see your level of satisfaction of this training, if it was useful, if not, how can we improve? Also, if you can acknowledge some gaps that you may find in your system or you would like to improve in the recent future. So you need to know that ideally would have done this training presential, but because of the COVID-19, we have to adopt this way of working together. But this training is much more intense, so it's full days training for a week. But okay, we hope that maybe in the future we can do similar trainings, more face-to-face, meet you all personally, and that would be best. And also we will be emitting a certificate of your participation, but we would like first that you fill the survey, please, because we want to improve and we need your feedback. And well, I see here in the chat box that excellent, thank you, Marianne. That's they are very satisfied, excellent 2 weeks, and the training was very fruitful, it was instructive. And I would like to thank you, all the participants, for your reliability and being there every day, because I know that everyone has a very tight schedule and you found time to follow this training. And well, so if you have some further questions or some feedback, please don't hesitate to contact us. You have our email, and we are always here, PAHO, to help you and support you in everything we can. And well, so okay, here they said, oh, I wish the training will have continued longer from an AK. So okay, we will see. Maybe we can make a second refresher training. We can discuss this in the future. And well, so from my side, I don't have anything to say. Also to thank Marianne Green for all her time and support. She's really a risk-based inspection expert. She has a lot of experience in all over the world, and I'm happy that she was available for us to give this training. Also, I would like to thank my team for supporting with the Zoom platform, Marcos, Rosanna, and Jonathan. That today Marcos is accompanying me. Yeah, I have here the raised hand from Karin. Maybe she has some comment.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just want to personally and on behalf of my colleagues to thank you all for this training. It was very insightful. It was very educational and informative, especially in this virtual space. It has really broke the silence and the boredom. And I look forward to more training like this. I see some people typing that it was excellent. It was, you know, relevant and timely. And I do share their sentiments. I do hope that this is only but a bus stop for all of us. And we will catch the next bus for our destination to make food safety a better product going forward, especially in this new dispensation. I thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you very much for your words. I think, and I know that Jamaica is making a lot of progress, and I think it's one of the model countries within the Caribbean with a very robust system, but it's improving more because there is always space for improvement, and I'm happy that you are so engaged with it. Yeah, we have a comment from Susan, and I think from Evan also, if I so correct.
Yes, I just want to send out a request. I'm not sure what PAHO is doing, but World Food Safety Day is June 7. It's actually, it has to be virtual. So if there is any training or maybe one aspect or something that we could perhaps do virtually, and we can open it up to all inspectors, and on another one for industry, just in the celebration of that event, that would be great. I'm just putting it out there from now.
This is an excellent idea, Susan. Actually, well, we are going to sit with the FAO next week to discuss the 7th of June, but actually we would like to also from headquarters in Geneva, they were asking me if countries could send me some success stories on their inspection system or risk analysis or foodborne disease rate, etc. You know that food safety is very complex, so in any subject. So, and if Jamaica wants to submit like a short video with a success story on something specific, you are very welcome. So maybe it's published in the worldwide video, or we are also thinking to create a regional video here, you know. Also, we would like to.
Come on, good on. Very good idea. I will do my part.
Yeah,
as best
so
as I can.
Send me your.
So come.
Yes. Oh, I'm not sure who is talking. So also because we as FAO and PAHO, so we are going to do something regional, virtual for everyone, but I encourage every country to create their own virtual seminar also, you know, because the regional, we are going to do general, and there is not so enough space for all countries to have a presentation, but we are going to try to make a video with success stories. And actually, we want to prepare a video for sub-regional Caribbean and another for Latin America. But later within your country, please, if you have some ideas to develop something virtually or some campaign, and also if you want to pass us this success story or idea or videos, please go ahead. Also, you can share it with us, and if we can support Jamaica in something to celebrate this day, please, we are here also, and you count on us, and you just share the idea, and we see we can also support. But for me, it will be important that countries from the region, in Caribbean and Latin America, they share their experience at the global platform, right? And also here. So I hope that this can help, and you have my email, and please just join internally in Jamaica and see what is best. Maybe you want to share some experience in some specific industry with inspection or specific value chain. So, and I think this could help. I hope that I answer your question, Susan.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. I'm looking forward to partnering. That's a big.
Yeah, because I think Jamaica has very good systems in place in different value chains, and I think it can be a good model to present. Karin?
Will we be given a certificate for this training?
I think, well, we will try to, we will try to send today all the documents and the survey. Please, you have to fill the survey. Once we receive your survey, fill. So it's very short, it goes quick. We will emit the certificates. I think by next week, you will have the certificates because we send the survey today or Monday. And so as soon as you fill it, you will receive your certificate. Because you have to give your name and last name, and we take all this data from there.
All right, not a problem. Thank you.
No problem, Karin.
No problem, my dear. Bless you.
Okay, so God bless you all, my Jamaica colleagues. And then we keep in touch, and please, we are always here at PAHO. You can always write PAHO country office, and they communicate with you if you need anything on food safety.
Definitely. Be sure to come down.
All right.
After the pandemic.
Hello.
Evan, yes.
Yes, as just want to reiterate, great training, and it would have been lovely when it's repeated that some more inspectors could be involved. I think it would be very, very valuable for them. Marianne mentioned that one day isn't enough to discuss sampling, so I'm wondering if possible, we could have a training that looks specifically at sampling. I don't know how possible that is, but if you have, please involve us. We'd be happy to participate.
Yes, sure. We can organize. So you just need to think of a date. I think I would prefer you have some time to digest all the information you received these 2 weeks, and maybe in 1 month or 2 months, we just can organize something more specific that you need, targeted, and just let me know and we can arrange something like this.
Okay, thank you very much.
It will take me a little bit of time to move any sort of document forward for 2-week training periods. So Marguerite and I can talk about that, but I don't want to commit to dates until I can think about my time frame for other commitments that I have too.
So thank you, Marianne. Yes, because I'm always in speed, sorry, so very fast. So yeah, we see because. But
it's doable. It's just, it has to be scheduled.
Yeah, yes. All right, so if there is no more comments, I thank you all for all your commitment with risk-based food inspection, and I wish you a very nice day, and please keep safe. See you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Please do the
everybody.
same.
Thank you. You keep safe too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Margarita. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary,
Margarita, and Marco, and the entire team. Thank you.
Love you all. Be safe.
Love you. Bye-bye.